On the 10th of August, a little over a month after the demise of my flourishing town speculation, I found myself facing a new challenge, establishing a trading post in the untamed Gold Lake region. I myself was never the kind to prospect for gold by pecking at the ground. Rather, I found my thrill in the prospecting of the pockets of miners through the provision of mining supplies to those fortune seekers out there amidst the fresh-cut wilderness. I made an arrangement with some gentlemen in Marysville, and we purchased 12 beautiful Peruvian mules with necessary Arapahoes, Mexican pack saddles, besides a riding mule, and engaged an American who could speak Spanish and a Mexican who did not understand a word of English. Selecting a desirable stock of goods, we were ready to start on the afternoon of the 14th. Accompanying us was Mr. Brinkerhoff, a merchant of Marysville, who had also engaged a driver from Mexico. Our initial journey was inauspicious. The mules, unused to labor, preferred to lay down rather than work. Each time one was packed, it would saunter off and lay down, disarranging its load and requiring repacking. By sunset, we found ourselves only 1.5 miles from Marysville, despite setting out at 2 o'clock. Leaving Billy, the interpreter, and the 2 Mexicans to guard the property, Mr. Brinkerhoff and I returned to town for the night. The next morning, we discovered one of our best mules missing. After a fruitless half-day search, we sent its load back to town and proceeded. We had only traveled 2 miles when another mule, having an axe tied to its pack, laid down and cut an artery in its foreleg, bleeding to death. I transferred its load to my mule and walked. Over the next 2 days, we managed to cover only 5 miles due to the mule's reluctance and frequent lying down. On the 3rd morning, it took the hired hands nearly 3 hours to pack the mules. Our animals began to travel better, though we still faced difficulties with slipping packs and the occasional mule lying down. While trudging along, I stopped to write a mule's pack. The driver, who couldn't communicate well, grew increasingly frustrated with my attempts to help. After several failed attempts to adjust the pack, he secured the ropes himself, cursing me as a damned Americano. As we continued, the day grew extremely hot, and our pace slowed. We reached a spring in the gorge of the first hills, slaking our burning thirst. The serious difficulties with our mules were now over. They were broken in, and, except for occasional pack slipping, we had little trouble. As we reached the mountains by degrees, they became steeper and more difficult, and by 5 o'clock, footsore and exhausted, I lay down in the shade of a manzanita, about 2 miles from where the train proposed to encamp. After resting an hour, I plodded on and found them encamped in a narrow valley with a beautiful stream flowing through it, having made about 20 miles, a very fair day's drive. We went early to bed, and were indeed tired enough to sleep sound. About 2 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by a strange noise near us. Raising my head above my blankets, I saw within 3 rods of us a huge California lion, standing and gazing at us, quietly frisking his tail. But as he did not appear to assume a belligerent attitude, and my companions were sleeping heavily, I did not alarm them. The animal, probably having satisfied his curiosity, turned off in another direction, and I laid down and soon went to sleep again. The following morning the drivers packed the mules, and we kept them in motion to prevent them from lying down. We traveled 10 miles through a narrow valley, reaching our camp early. Our general course from Maryville was northeast, with the terrain predominantly granite, feldspar, and mica, yet quartz veins were frequent. There was no basaltic or trap rock visible through this range, which was the case generally from north to south through the mountains. The next day we faced 20 miles of rough country without forage for our animals. Making an early start, we left our valley trail, our path now leading along a sidling hill, occasionally over ledges of granite rock, towards the dividing ridge between the waters of Feather River and the Yuba. We ascended all the while until at noon we found ourselves upon the summit of a hill, which overlooked the hills below and the Sacramento Valley far beyond, forming a beautiful view. The timber had been chiefly evergreen oak, but now we were amidst the most magnificent pines and cedars I ever beheld. I estimated many at 250 feet in height, perfectly straight, and 8 feet in diameter at the base. The hills were covered with pumice and lava for miles, incontestably proving that somewhere in the vicinity there had existed, at some time, an active volcano. The granite formation now changed to talcous slate, the soil a deep reddish brown, peroxide of iron, and the indications of gold were much greater than below. For many miles we passed over a mountain plain sparsely covered with trees, but on which there was a heavy growth of chaparral, which would have made it a work of much labor to make a road over in any other than the way in which it had been done. This was accomplished by wagons marking out a track over the packed snow, gradually wearing down the tops of the bushes and occasionally using axes to clear around rocks. We had long been traveling without water. Mr. Brinkerhoff and I were some distance ahead of the train when, near the roadside, amid a dense cluster of beautiful pines, we discovered a sparkling spring. He spurred his mule to a gallop, and weary as I was, I started on a run, and to my satisfaction, I reached it first. It was a delicious draught, and we lingered until we could drink no more, and then proceeded on our journey. We began to descend, and 1.5 miles of traveling brought us to the verge of a steep and difficult mountain, at the base of which lay the Grass Valley, where the South Fork of Feather River heads. This valley lay nestled in the hills, surrounded by high red mountains. It was about 1/2 mile wide by 5 or 6 in length, but its high altitude made it very cold, with heavy frosts every night during the warmest summer weather. A little higher up, on the northern side, a singular bald peak, probably 2,000 feet high, lifted its naked head above the surrounding hills, without a tree or shrub to enliven its bold prominence. At about 2/3 of the distance to its summit, large projections of slate rock, hundreds of feet high, stood towering out from its sides like huge portals to some subterranean castle. Here, in this strange valley, where 2 months prior there had been no living soul, and where the snow was 20 feet deep, we found a cluster of cabins and cloth stores, with groceries and hotels, and the usual trappings of a mining town, scores of money banks. Where the miner goes, no matter how difficult the transit, the gambler follows, tempting him to part with his hard-earned gains in a game of chance. Families of women and children, undeterred by the fatigue and dangers of the trip, had also come to seek their fortunes. We encamped on the green sward by the stream, sleeping soundly despite the cold. The next morning we found 1 mule missing and spent the day searching for it. A quarrel broke out between Billy and my Mexican driver, leading to the Mexican drawing a knife and Billy responding with a pistol. The Mexican retreated, and I discharged him. Mr. Brinkerhoff's muleteer agreed to assist with packing, and Billy and I took over as drivers. Our troubles continued as another mule disappeared. We spent half a day searching, eventually recovering it. Then, we faced a steep hill with a high ledge of glazed and vitrified rock that glistened in the sun like glass. After hours of toil, we reached the summit, where a magnificent scene unfolded. We were on a lofty ridge, surrounded by towering mountains and deep gorges. The broken chains of mountains and the sight of the distant Sierra Nevada filled me with awe. Despite being a simple mule driver, I couldn't help but be moved by this grand display of nature. Following the ridge, we descended towards Onion Valley, a small valley known for its wild onions. Snow still lingered in spots, a welcome relief for our parched tongues. Nightfall found us exhausted and ready for a much-needed rest. We had not yet decided where to establish our post. My friend, S.B. Gridley, had a trading post at Nelson's Creek. I proposed consulting with him while the train followed. The trail ascended a ridge and then descended to the river, threading narrow, precipitous paths. Gridley advised us to go to Independence, 4 miles up the creek. Mr. Brinkerhoff mistakenly took the left-hand trail and descended to the flat. While moving the mules, one of his slipped and fell to its death. Another mule fell into the creek but was not seriously injured. Eventually, we encamped, paying dearly for barley to feed our mules. The next morning, we attempted to ascend the hill again. 4 mules, in a sudden fit of amiability, tumbled down, smashing supplies and bursting kegs of brandy. By noon, we reached the first bench, and by nightfall, we descended the deep gorge to Independence, only 4 miles from the creek's mouth. Such is the difficulty of driving mules and of taking supplies into the distant mines of California before time is given to survey more eligible roads. And in some places these cannot be found. Verily, the muleteer, as well as the miner, earns his money through severe hardship. Nevertheless, Brinkerhoff and I soon had our stores established, and our first stocks sold readily and well. There were from 1,000 to 2,000 men in the neighborhood, and the diggings generally paid well. We immediately ordered a new and good supply of provisions, but it was nearly 3 weeks before they arrived. In the meantime, Mr. Brinkerhoff was violently seized with bilious fever when I took him into my tent and attended him to convalescence, though this time I did not pursue my Indian practice. On the 16th of September, a few days before our new supplies arrived, the first storm of the season fell, though this was snow on the hills and rain in the gulches. Knowing that in the mountains the snow fell many feet deep, remembering the inclement season of the previous year, and being unprovided with provisions for the winter when supplies could not be obtained, the miners became alarmed, and fearing they would be caught in the impassable snows, they hastily abandoned their claims, so that in less than a week there were but 20 men left on our populous bar. As they left, our goods came. We had plenty of goods, but no customers. Brink suggested we give the confounded goods a dose of calomel, as I had when he was out with the fever. But as that would not pay, I did not follow his advice. After selling what we could at Independence, we procured mules and took them to the mouth of the creek, paying 5 cents a pound for transportation, where, at length, we closed the sales, I and my partners losing about $1,000 in the operation, and had the storm held off 2 weeks longer, we probably should have cleared double that amount.